Welcome to our channel. Hollywood Movie Review. Citizen Kane 1941 Movie Review. Citizen Kane is a 1941 American drama film directed, produced by, and starring Orson Welles and co-written by Welles and Herman J. Mankiewicz. It was Welles's first feature film. The quasi-biographical film examines the life and legacy of Charles Foster Kane, played by Welles, a composite character based on American media barons William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, and Chicago tycoons Samuel Insull and Harold McCormick, as well as aspects of the screenwriter's own lives. After the Broadway success of Welles's Mercury Theatre and the controversial 1938 radio broadcast The War of the Worlds on the Mercury Theatre on the air, Welles was courted by Hollywood. He signed a contract with RKO Pictures in 1939. Although it was unusual for an untried director, he was given freedom to develop his own story, to use his own cast and crew, and to have final cut privilege. Following two abortive attempts to get a project off the ground, he wrote the screenplay for Citizen Kane with Herman J. Mankiewicz. Principal photography took place in 1940, the same year that its innovative trailer was shown, and the film was released in 1941. Upon its release, Hearst prohibited any mention of the film in his newspapers. Although it was a critical success, Citizen Kane failed to recoup its costs at the box office. The film faded from view after its release, but returned to public attention when it was praised by French critics such as André Bazin and re-released in 1956. In 1958, the film was voted number 9 on the prestigious Brussels 12 list at the 1958 World Expo. Citizen Kane is frequently cited as the greatest film ever made. For 40 years, 5 decennial polls, 1962, 1972, 1982, 1992, and 2002, it stood at number 1 in the British Film Institute's Sight and Sound Decennial Poll, and it topped the American Film Institute's 100 Years 100 Movies list in 1998, as well as its 2007 update. The Library of Congress selected Citizen Kane as an inductee of the 1989 inaugural group of 25 films for preservation in the United States National Film Registry for being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. The film was nominated for Academy Awards in 9 categories, and it won for Best Writing, Original Screenplay, by Mankiewicz and Welles. Citizen Kane is praised for Greg Toland's cinematography, Robert Wise's editing, Bernard Herrmann's score and its narrative structure, all of which have been considered innovative and precedent-setting. In a mansion called Xanadu, part of a vast palatial estate in Florida, the elderly Charles Foster Kane is on his deathbed. Holding a snow globe, he utters his last word, "Rosebud," and dies. A newsreel obituary tells the life story of Kane, an enormously wealthy newspaper publisher and industry magnate. Kane's death becomes sensational news around the world, and the newsreel's producer tasks reporter Jerry Thompson with discovering the meaning of Rosebud. Thompson sets out to interview Kane's friends and associates. He tries to approach Kane's second wife, Susan Alexander Kane, now an alcoholic nightclub owner, but she refuses to talk to him. Thompson goes to the private archive of the late banker Walter Parks Thatcher. Through Thatcher's written memoirs, Thompson learns about Kane's rise from a Colorado boarding house and the decline of his fortune. In 1871, gold was discovered through a mining deed belonging to Kane's mother, Mary Kane. She hired Thatcher to establish a trust that would provide for Kane's education and assume guardianship of him, protecting him from his brutal father. While the parents and Thatcher discussed arrangements inside the boarding house, the young Kane played happily with a sled in the snow outside. When his parents introduced him to Thatcher and told him he would live with him, the boy struck Thatcher with his sled and attempted to run away. By the time Kane gained control of his trust at the age of 25, the mine's productivity and Thatcher's prudent investing had made Kane one of the richest men in the world. Kane took control of the New York Inquirer newspaper and embarked on a career of yellow journalism, publishing scandalous articles that attacked Thatcher's, and his own, business interests. Kane sold his newspaper empire to Thatcher after the 1929 stock market crash left him short of cash. Thompson interviews Kane's personal business manager, Mr. Bernstein. Bernstein recalls that Kane hired the best journalists available to build the Enquirer's circulation. Kane rose to power by successfully manipulating public opinion regarding the Spanish-American War and marrying Emily Norton, the niece of the President of the United States. Thompson interviews Kane's estranged best friend, Jedediah Leland, in a retirement home. Leland says that Kane's marriage to Emily disintegrated over the years, despite their having a son, and he began an affair with amateur singer Susan Alexander while running for governor of New York as a fighting liberal. His political opponent, corrupt boss Jim W. Geddes, discovered the affair and forced Susan to write to Emily about it, and the public scandal ended Kane's political career. Kane married Susan and forced her into a humiliating career as an opera singer, for which she had neither talent nor ambition. Kane then built a large opera house in Chicago for Susan to perform in. After Leland began to write a negative review of Susan's disastrous opera debut, Kane fired him but finished the negative review and printed it. Susan protested that she never wanted the opera career anyway, but Kane forced her to continue the season. Susan consents to an interview with Thompson and describes the aftermath of her opera career. She attempted suicide, and Kane finally allowed her to abandon singing. After many unhappy years living at Xanadu with Kane, the two had an argument that culminated in Kane slapping Susan. Susan decided to leave Kane. Kane's butler Raymond recounts that, after Susan moved out of Xanadu, Kane began violently destroying the contents of her former bedroom. When Kane discovered a snow globe, he calmed down and tearfully said Rosebud. Thompson concludes that he cannot solve the mystery and that the meaning of Kane's last word will remain unknown. At Xanadu, Kane's belongings are catalogued or discarded by the mansion staff as Thompson leaves. They find a sled, the one on which 8-year-old Kane was playing on the day he was taken from his home in Colorado, and throw it into a furnace with other items. Unknown to the staff, the sled's trade name, printed on top, becomes visible through the flames, Rosebud. The sled's smoke rises from the chimney as the view pulls back to a sign on Xanadu's outer fence which also began the film, No Trespassing. Hollywood had shown interest in Wells as early as 1936. He turned down 3 scripts sent to him by Warner Brothers. In 1937, he declined offers from David O. Selznick, who asked him to head his film company's story department, and William Wyler, who wanted him for a supporting role in Wuthering Heights. Although the possibility of making huge amounts of money in Hollywood greatly attracted him, wrote biographer Frank Brady, he was still totally, hopelessly, insanely in love with the theater, and it is there that he had every intention of remaining to make his mark. Following the 1938 The War of the Worlds broadcast of his CBS radio series The Mercury Theater on the Air, Wells was lured to Hollywood with a remarkable contract. RKO Pictures studio head George J. Schaefer wanted to work with Wells after the notorious broadcast, believing that Wells had a gift for attracting mass attention. RKO was also uncharacteristically profitable and was entering into a series of independent production contracts that would add more artistically prestigious films to its roster. Throughout the spring and early summer of 1939, Schaefer constantly tried to lure the reluctant Wells to Hollywood. Wells was in financial trouble after failure of his plays Five Kings and The Green Goddess. At first he simply wanted to spend 3 months in Hollywood and earn enough money to pay his debts and fund his next theatrical season. Wells first arrived on July 20, 1939, and on his first tour, he called the movie studio the greatest electric train set a boy ever had. Wells signed his contract with RKO on August 21, which stipulated that Wells would act in, direct, produce and write 2 films. Mercury would get $100,000 for the first film by January 1, 1940, plus 20% of profits after RKO recouped $500,000, and $125,000 for a second film by January 1, 1941, plus 20% of profits after RKO recouped $500,000. The most controversial aspect of the contract was granting Wells complete artistic control of the two films so long as RKO approved both projects' stories and the budget did not exceed $500,000. RKO executives would not be allowed to see any footage until Wells chose to show it to them, and no cuts could be made to either film without Wells's approval. Wells was allowed to develop the story without interference, select his own cast and crew, and have the right of final cut. Granting the final cut privilege was unprecedented for a studio because it placed artistic considerations over financial investment. The contract was deeply resented in the film industry, and the Hollywood press took every opportunity to mock RKO and Wells. Schaefer remained a great supporter and saw the unprecedented contract as good publicity. Film scholar Robert L. Carringer wrote, "The simple fact seems to be that Schaefer believed Wells was going to pull off something really big almost as much as Wells did himself." Wells spent the first 5 months of his RKO contract trying to get his first project going, without success. "They are laying bets over on the RKO lot that the Orson-Wells deal will end up without Orson ever doing a picture there," wrote The Hollywood Reporter. It was agreed that Wells would film Heart of Darkness, previously adapted for the Mercury Theater on the air, which would be presented entirely through a first-person camera. After elaborate pre-production and a day of test shooting with a handheld camera unheard of at the time, the project never reached production because Wells was unable to trim $50,000 from its budget. Schaefer told Wells that the $500,000 budget could not be exceeded. As war loomed, revenue was declining sharply in Europe by the fall of 1939. He then started work on the idea that became Citizen Kane. Knowing the script would take time to prepare, Wells suggested to RKO that while that was being done so the year wouldn't be lost, he make a humorous political thriller. Wells proposed The Smiler with a Knife, from a novel by Cecil D. Lewis. 34 When that project stalled in December 1939, Wells began brainstorming other story ideas with screenwriter Herman J. Mankiewicz, who had been writing Mercury radio scripts. Arguing, inventing, discarding, these two powerful, headstrong, dazzlingly articulate personalities thrashed toward Kane, wrote biographer Richard Merriman. "I wished to make a motion picture which was not a narrative of action so much as an examination of character. For this, I desired a man of many sides and many aspects. It was my idea to show that 6 or more people could have as many widely divergent opinions concerning the nature of a single personality. There have been many motion pictures and novels rigorously obeying the formula of the success story. I wished to do something quite different. I wished to make a picture which might be called a failure story." One of the long-standing controversies about Citizen Kane has been the authorship of the screenplay. Wells conceived the project with screenwriter Herman J. Mankiewicz, who was writing radio plays for Wells' CBS radio series, The Campbell Playhouse. Mankiewicz based the original outline on the life of William Randolph Hearst, whom he knew socially and came to hate after being exiled from Hearst's circle. In February 1940, Wells supplied Mankiewicz with 300 pages of notes and put him under contract to write the first draft screenplay under the supervision of John Houseman, Wells's former partner in the Mercury Theater. Wells later explained, "I left him on his own finally, because we'd started to waste too much time haggling. So, after mutual agreements on storyline and character, Mank went off with Houseman and did his version, while I stayed in Hollywood and wrote mine." Taking these drafts, Wells drastically condensed and rearranged them, then added scenes of his own. The industry accused Wells of underplaying Mankiewicz's contribution to the script, but Wells countered the attacks by saying, "At the end, naturally, I was the one making the picture, after all, who had to make the decisions. I used what I wanted of Manx and, rightly or wrongly, kept what I liked of my own." The contract stated that Mankiewicz was to receive no credit for his work, as he was hired as a script doctor. Before he signed the contract, Mankiewicz was advised by his agents that all credit for his work belonged to Wells and the Mercury Theater, the author and creator. As the film neared release, however, Mankiewicz began wanting a writing credit and even threatened to take out full-page advertisements in trade papers and to get his friend Ben Hecht to write an exposé for the Saturday Evening Post. Mankiewicz also threatened to go to the Screenwriters Guild and claim full credit for writing the entire script by himself. After lodging a protest with the Screenwriters Guild, Mankiewicz withdrew it, then vacillated. The question was resolved in January 1941 when the studio, RKO Pictures, awarded Mankiewicz credit. The Guild credit form listed Wells first, Mankiewicz second. Wells's assistant Richard Wilson said that the person who circled Mankiewicz's name in pencil, then drew an arrow that put it in first place, was Wells. The official credit reads, screenplay by Herman J. Mankiewicz and Orson Welles. Mankiewicz's rancor toward Welles grew over the remaining 12 years of his life. And questions over the authorship of the Citizen Kane screenplay were revived in 1971 by influential film critic Pauline Kael, whose controversial 50,000-word essay Raising Kane was commissioned as an introduction to the shooting script in the Citizen Kane book, published in October 1971. In it she called Citizen Kane the culmination of that sustained feat of careless magic we call 30s comedy. The book-length essay first appeared in February 1971, in 2 consecutive issues of the New Yorker magazine. In the ensuing controversy, Welles was defended by colleagues, critics, biographers, and scholars, but his reputation was damaged by its charges. The essay's thesis was later questioned and some of Kael's findings were also contested in later years. Questions of authorship continued to come into sharper focus with Carringer's 1978 thoroughly researched essay, The Scripts of Citizen Kane. Carringer studied the collection of script records, almost a day-to-day record of the history of the scripting that was then still intact at RKO. He reviewed all 7 drafts and concluded that the full evidence reveals that Wells's contribution to the Citizen Kane script was not only substantial but definitive. Citizen Kane was a rare film in that its principal roles were played by actors new to motion pictures. 10 were billed as Mercury actors, members of the skilled repertory company assembled by Welles for the stage and radio performances of the Mercury Theatre, an independent theater company he founded with Houseman in 1937. He loved to use the Mercury players, wrote biographer Charles Hyam, and consequently he launched several of them on movie careers. The film represents the feature film debuts of William Alland, Ray Collins, Joseph Cotten, Agnes Moorehead, Erskine Sanford, Everett Sloane, Paul Stewart and Welles himself. Despite never having appeared in feature films, some of the cast members were already well known to the public. Cotten had recently become a Broadway star in the hit play The Philadelphia Story with Katharine Hepburn, and Sloane was well known for his role on the radio show The Goldbergs. Mercury actor George Couleris was a star of the stage in New York and London. Not all of the cast came from the Mercury players. Welles cast Dorothy Cumming-Gore, an actress who played supporting parts in films since 1938 using the name Linda Winters, as Susan Alexander Kane. A discovery of Charlie Chaplin, Cumming-Gore was recommended to Welles by Chaplin, who then met Cumming-Gore at a party in Los Angeles and immediately cast her. Welles had met stage actress Ruth Warrick while visiting New York on a break from Hollywood and remembered her as a good fit for Emily Norton Kane, later saying that she looked the part. Warrick told Carringer that she was struck by the extraordinary resemblance between herself and Wells's mother when she saw a photograph of Beatrice Ives Wells. She characterized her own personal relationship with Welles as motherly. He trained us for films at the same time that he was training himself, recalled Agnes Moorehead. Orson believed in good acting, and he realized that rehearsals were needed to get the most from his actors. That was something new in Hollywood. Nobody seemed interested in bringing in a group to rehearse before scenes were shot. But Orson knew it was necessary, and we rehearsed every sequence before it was shot. When the March of Time narrator Westbrook Van Voorhis asked for $25,000 to narrate the news on the March sequence, Allen demonstrated his ability to imitate Van Voorhis, and Welles cast him. Welles later said that casting character actor Gino Corrado in the small part of the waiter at the El Rancho broke his heart. Corrado had appeared in many Hollywood films, often as a waiter, and Wells wanted all of the actors to be new to films. Other uncredited roles went to Thomas A. Curran as Teddy Roosevelt in the faux newsreel, Richard Bear as Hillman, a man at Madison Square Garden, and a man in the news on the March screening room, and Alan Ladd, Arthur O'Connell, and Louise Curry as reporters at Xanadu. Production advisor Miriam Geiger quickly compiled a handmade film textbook for Wells, a practical reference book of film techniques that he studied carefully. He then taught himself filmmaking by matching its visual vocabulary to the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which he ordered from the Museum of Modern Art, and films by Frank Capra, René Clair, Fritz Lang, King Vidor, and Jean Renoir. The one film he genuinely studied was John Ford's Stagecoach, which he watched 40 times. As it turned out, the first day I ever walked onto a set was my first day as a director, Wells said. I'd learned whatever I knew in the projection room from Ford. After dinner every night for about a month, I'd run Stagecoach, often with some different technician or department head from the studio, and ask questions. How was this done? Why was this done? It was like going to school. Wells's cinematographer for the film was Greg Toland, described by Wells as just then, the #1 cameraman in the world. To Wells's astonishment, Toland visited him at his office and said, "I want you to use me on your picture." He had seen some of the Mercury stage productions, including Caesar, and said he wanted to work with someone who had never made a movie. RKO hired Toland on loan from Samuel Goldwyn Productions in the first week of June 1940. And he never tried to impress us that he was doing any miracles, Wells recalled. I was calling for things only a beginner would have been ignorant enough to think anybody could ever do, and there he was, doing them. Toland later explained that he wanted to work with Wells because he anticipated the first-time director's inexperience and reputation for audacious experimentation in the theater would allow the cinematographer to try new and innovative camera techniques that typical Hollywood films would never have allowed him to do. Unaware of filmmaking protocol, Wells adjusted the lights on set as he was accustomed to doing in the theater. Toland quietly rebalanced them, and was angry when one of the crew informed Wells that he was infringing on Toland's responsibilities. 6:06 During the first few weeks of June, Wells had lengthy discussions about the film with Toland and art director Perry Ferguson in the morning, and in the afternoon and evening he worked with actors and revised the script. On June 29, 1940, a Saturday morning when few inquisitive studio executives would be around, Wells began filming Citizen Kane. After the disappointment of having Heart of Darkness cancelled, Wells followed Ferguson's suggestion and deceived RKO into believing that he was simply shooting camera tests. But we were shooting the picture, Wells said, because we wanted to get started and be already into it before anybody knew about it. At the time, RKO executives were pressuring him to agree to direct a film called The Men from Mars, to capitalize on the War of the Worlds radio broadcast. Wells said that he would consider making the project but wanted to make a different film first. At this time he did not inform them that he had already begun filming Citizen Kane. The early footage was called Orson Welles Tests on All Paperwork. The first test shot was the news on the March projection room scene, economically filmed in a real studio projection room in darkness that masked many actors who appeared in other roles later in the film. At $809, Orson did run substantially beyond the test budget of $528 to create one of the most famous scenes in movie history, wrote Barton Whaley. The next scenes were the El Rancho nightclub scenes and the scene in which Susan attempts suicide. Wells later said that the nightclub set was available after another film had wrapped and that filming took 10 to 12 days to complete. For these scenes, Wells had Common Gore's throat sprayed with chemicals to give her voice a harsh, raspy tone. 170 to 171 other scenes shot in secret included those in which Thompson interviews Leland and Bernstein, which were also shot on sets built for other films during production. The film was referred to as RKO 281. Most of the filming took place in what is now Stage 19 on the Paramount Pictures lot in Hollywood. There was some location filming at Balboa Park in San Diego and the San Diego Zoo. Photographs of German Jewish investment banker Otto Hermann Kahn's real-life estate Ahaka Castle were used to portray the fictional Xanadu. In the end of July, RKO approved the film and Welles was allowed to officially begin shooting, despite having already been filming tests for several weeks. Welles leaked stories to newspaper reporters that the tests had been so good that there was no need to reshoot them. The first official scene to be shot was the breakfast montage sequence between Kane and his first wife Emily. To strategically save money and appease the RKO executives who opposed him, Welles rehearsed scenes extensively before actually shooting and filmed very few takes of each shot set up. Welles never shot master shots for any scene after Toland told him that Ford never shot them. To appease the increasingly curious press, Welles threw a cocktail party for selected reporters, promising that they could watch a scene being filmed. When the journalists arrived, Welles told them they had just finished shooting for the day but still had the party. Welles told the press that he was ahead of schedule, without factoring in the month of test shooting, thus discrediting claims that after a year in Hollywood without making a film he was a failure in the film industry. Welles usually worked 16 to 18 hours a day on the film. He often began work at 4 a.m. since the special effects makeup used to age him for certain scenes took up to 4 hours to apply. Welles used this time to discuss the day's shooting with Toland and other crew members. The special contact lenses used to make Welles look elderly proved very painful, and a doctor was employed to place them into Welles's eyes. Welles had difficulty seeing clearly while wearing them, which caused him to badly cut his wrist when shooting the scene in which Kane breaks up the furniture in Susan's bedroom. While shooting the scene in which Kane shouts at Gettys on the stairs of Susan Alexander's apartment building, Welles fell 10 feet, an X-ray revealed 2 bone chips in his ankle. The injury required him to direct the film from a wheelchair for 2 weeks. He eventually wore a steel brace to resume performing on camera. It is visible in the low-angle scene between Kane and Leland after Kane loses the election. For the final scene, a stage at the Selznick studio was equipped with a working furnace, and multiple takes were required to show the sled being put into the fire and the word rosebud consumed. Paul Stewart recalled that on the 9th take the Culver City Fire Department arrived in full gear because the furnace had grown so hot the flue caught fire. Orson was delighted with the commotion, he said. When Rosebud was burned, Welles precisely choreographed every aspect of the scene while he had composer Bernard Herrmann's cue playing on the set. Unlike Schaefer, many members of RKO's Board of Governors did not like Welles or the control that his contract gave him. However, such board members as Nelson Rockefeller and NBC chief David Sarnoff were sympathetic to Welles. Throughout production, Welles had problems with these executives not respecting his contract's stipulation of non-interference, and several spies arrived on set to report what they saw to the executives. When the executives would sometimes arrive on set unannounced, the entire cast and crew would suddenly start playing softball until they left. Before official shooting began, the executives intercepted all copies of the script and delayed their delivery to Welles. They had one copy sent to their office in New York, resulting in it being leaked to press. Principal shooting wrapped October 24. Welles then took several weeks away from the film for a lecture tour, during which he also scouted additional locations with Toland and Ferguson. Filming resumed November with some reshoots. Toland had to leave due to a commitment to shoot Howard Hughes' The Outlaw, but Toland's camera crew continued working on the film and Toland was replaced by RKO cinematographer Harry J. Wilde. The final day of shooting on November 30 was Kane's death scene. Welles boasted that he only went 21 days over his official shooting schedule, without factoring in the month of camera tests. According to RKO records, the film cost $839,727. Its estimated budget had been $723,800. Citizen Kane was edited by Robert Wise and assistant editor Mark Robson. Both would become successful film directors. Wise was hired after Welles finished shooting the camera tests and began officially making the film. Wise said that Welles had an older editor assigned to him for those tests and evidently he was not too happy and asked to have somebody else. I was roughly Orson's age and had several good credits. Wise and Robson began editing the film while it was still shooting and said that they could tell certainly that we were getting something very special. It was outstanding film day in and day out. Welles gave Wise detailed instructions and was usually not present during the film's editing. The film was very well planned out and intentionally shot for such post-production techniques as slow dissolves. The lack of coverage made editing easy since Welles and Toland edited the film in camera by leaving few options of how it could be put together. Wise said the breakfast table sequence took weeks to edit and get the correct timing and rhythm for the whip pans and overlapping dialogue. The News on the March sequence was edited by RKO's newsreel division to give it authenticity. They used stock footage from Path News and the General Film Library. During post-production, Welles and special effects artist Linwood G. Dunn experimented with an optical printer to improve certain scenes that Welles found unsatisfactory from the footage. Whereas Welles was often immediately pleased with Wise's work, he would require Dunn and post-production audio engineer James G. Stewart to redo their work several times until he was satisfied. Welles hired Bernard Herrmann to compose the film's score. Where most Hollywood film scores were written quickly, in as few as 2 or 3 weeks after filming was completed, Herrmann was given 12 weeks to write the music. He had sufficient time to do his own orchestrations and conducting, and worked on the film reel by reel as it was shot and cut. He wrote complete musical pieces for some of the montages, and Welles edited many of the scenes to match their length. Film scholars and historians view Citizen Kane as Welles's attempt to create a new style of filmmaking by studying various forms of it and combining them into one. However, Welles stated that his love for cinema began only when he started working on the film. When asked where he got the confidence as a first-time director to direct a film so radically different from contemporary cinema, he responded, "Ignorance, ignorance. Sheer ignorance. You know, there's no confidence to equal it. It's only when you know something about a profession, I think, that you're timid or careful." David Bordwell wrote that the best way to understand Citizen Kane is to stop worshipping it as a triumph of technique. Bordwell argues that the film did not invent any of its famous techniques such as deep focus cinematography, shots of the ceilings, chiaroscuro lighting, and temporal jump cuts, and that many of these stylistics had been used in German expressionist films of the 1920s, such as The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. But Bordwell asserts that the film did put them all together for the first time and perfected the medium in one single film. In a 1948 interview, D.W. Griffith said, "I loved Citizen Kane and particularly loved the ideas he took from me." Arguments against the film's cinematic innovations were made as early as 1946 when French historian Georges Seydoux wrote, "The film is an encyclopedia of old techniques." He pointed out such examples as compositions that used both the foreground and the background in the films of Auguste and Louis Lumière, special effects used in the films of Georges Méliès, shots of the ceiling in Erich von Stroheim's Greed, and newsreel montages in the films of Gigi Vertov. French film critic André Bazin defended the film, writing, "In this respect, the accusation of plagiarism could very well be extended to the film's use of panchromatic film or its exploitation of the properties of gelatinous silver halide." Bazin disagreed with Seydoux's comparison to Lumiere's cinematography since Citizen Kane used more sophisticated lenses, but acknowledged that it had similarities to such previous works as The Power and the Glory. Bazin stated that even if Welles did not invent the cinematic devices employed in Citizen Kane, one should nevertheless credit him with the invention of their meaning. Bazin championed the techniques in the film for its depiction of heightened reality, but Bordwell believed that the film's use of special effects contradicted some of Bazin's theories. Nick Huey's Citizen Kane rejects the traditional linear, chronological narrative and tells Kane's story entirely in flashbacks using different points of view, many of them from Kane's aged and forgetful associates, the cinematic equivalent of the unreliable narrator in literature. Welles also dispenses with the idea of a single storyteller and uses multiple narrators to recount Kane's life, a technique not used previously in Hollywood films. Each narrator recounts a different part of Kane's life, with each story overlapping another. The film depicts Kane as an enigma, a complicated man who leaves viewers with more questions than answers as to his character, such as the newsreel footage where he is attacked for being both a communist and a fascist. The technique of flashbacks had been used in earlier films, notably The Power and the Glory, 1933, but no film was as immersed in it as Citizen Kane. Thompson the reporter acts as a surrogate for the audience, questioning Kane's associates and piecing together his life. Films typically had an omniscient perspective at the time, which Marilyn Fabe says give the audience the illusion that we are looking with impunity into a world which is unaware of our gaze. Citizen Kane also begins in that fashion until the news on the march sequence, after which we the audience see the film through the perspectives of others. The news on the march sequence gives an overview of Kane's entire life, and the film's entire story, at the beginning of the film, leaving the audience without the typical suspense of wondering how it will end. Instead, the film's repetitions of events compels the audience to analyze and wonder why Kane's life happened the way that it did, under the pretext of finding out what Rosebud means. The film then returns to the omniscient perspective in the final scene, when only the audience discovers what Rosebud is. The most innovative technical aspect of Citizen Kane is the extended use of deep focus, where the foreground, background, and everything in between are all in sharp focus. Cinematographer Toland did this through his experimentation with lenses and lighting. Toland described the achievement in an article for Theatre Arts magazine, made possible by the sensitivity of modern speed film. New developments in the science of motion picture photography are not abundant at this advanced stage of the game, but periodically one is perfected to make this a greater art. Of these I am in an excellent position to discuss what is termed panfocus, as I have been active for 2 years in its development and used it for the first time in Citizen Kane. Through its use, it is possible to photograph action from a range of 18 inches from the camera lens to over 200 feet away, with extreme foreground and background figures and action both recorded in sharp relief. Hitherto, the camera had to be focused either for a close or a distant shot, all efforts to encompass both at the same time resulting in one or the other being out of focus. This handicap necessitated the breaking up of a scene into long and short angles, with much consequent loss of realism. With panfocus, the camera, like the human eye, sees an entire panorama at once, with everything clear and lifelike. Another unorthodox method used in the film was the low-angle shots facing upwards, thus allowing ceilings to be shown in the background of several scenes. Every set was built with a ceiling, which broke with studio convention, and many were constructed of fabric that concealed microphones. Welles felt that the camera should show what the eye sees, and that it was a bad theatrical convention to pretend that there was no ceiling, a big lie in order to get all those terrible lights up there, he said. He became fascinated with the look of low angles, which made even dull interiors look interesting. One extremely low angle is used to photograph the encounter between Kane and Leland after Kane loses the election. A hole was dug for the camera, which required drilling into the concrete floor. Welles credited Toland on the same title card as himself. "It's impossible to say how much I owe to Greg," he said. "He was superb." He called Toland the best director of photography that ever existed. Citizen Kane's sound was recorded by Bailey Fessler and re-recorded in post-production by audio engineer James G. Stewart, both of whom had worked in radio. Stewart said that Hollywood films never deviated from a basic pattern of how sound could be recorded or used, but with Welles deviation from the pattern was possible because he demanded it. Although the film is known for its complex soundtrack, much of the audio is heard as it was recorded by Fessler and without manipulation. Welles used techniques from radio like overlapping dialogue. The scene in which characters sing "Oh, Mr. Kane" was especially complicated and required mixing several soundtracks together. He also used different sound perspectives to create the illusion of distances, such as in scenes at Xanadu where characters speak to each other at far distances. Welles experimented with sound in post-production, creating audio montages, and chose to create all of the sound effects for the film instead of using RKO's library of sound effects. Welles used an oral technique from radio called the lightning mix. Welles used this technique to link complex montage sequences via a series of related sounds or phrases. For example, Kane grows from a child into a young man in just 2 shots. As Thatcher hands 8-year-old Kane a sled and wishes him a Merry Christmas, the sequence suddenly jumps to a shot of Thatcher 15 years later, completing the sentence he began in both the previous shot and the chronological past. Other radio techniques include using a number of voices, each saying a sentence or sometimes merely a fragment of a sentence, and splicing the dialogue together in quick succession, such as the projection room scene. The film's sound cost $16,996, but was originally budgeted at $7,288. Film critic and director François Truffaut wrote that before Kane, nobody in Hollywood knew how to set music properly in movies. Kane was the first, in fact the only, great film that uses radio techniques. A lot of filmmakers know enough to follow Auguste Renoir's advice to fill the eyes with images at all costs, but only Orson Welles understood that the soundtrack had to be filled in the same way. Cedric Belfridge of The Clipper wrote of all of the delectable flavors that linger on the palate after seeing Kane, the use of sound is the strongest. The makeup for Citizen Kane was created and applied by Maurice Siderman, a junior member of the RKO makeup department. He had not been accepted into the union, which recognized him as only an apprentice, but RKO nevertheless used him to make up principal actors. Apprentices were not supposed to make up any principals, only extras, and an apprentice could not be on a set without a journeyman present, wrote makeup artist Dick Smith, who became friends with Siderman in 1979. During his years at RKO, I suspect these rules were probably overlooked often. Siderman had gained a reputation as one of the most inventive and creatively precise up-and-coming makeup men in Hollywood, wrote biographer Frank Brady. On an early tour of RKO, Welles met Siderman in the small makeup lab that he created for himself in an unused dressing room. Welles fastened onto him at once, wrote biographer Charles Hyam, as Siderman had developed his own makeup methods that ensured complete naturalness of expression and naturalness unrivaled in Hollywood. Siderman developed a thorough plan for aging the principal characters, first making a plaster cast of the face of each of the actors who aged. He made a plaster mold of Welles's body down to the hips. My sculptural techniques for the characters' aging were handled by adding pieces of white modeling clay, which matched the plaster, onto the surface of each bust, Siderman told Norman Gambill. When Siderman achieved the desired effect, he cast the clay pieces in a soft plastic material that he formulated himself. These appliances were then placed onto the plaster bust and a 4-piece mold was made for each phase of aging. The castings were then fully painted and paired with the appropriate wig for evaluation. Before the actors went before the cameras each day, the pliable pieces were applied directly to their faces to recreate Siderman's sculptural image. The facial surface was underpainted in a flexible red plastic compound. The red ground resulted in a warmth of tone that was picked up by the panchromatic film. Over that was applied liquid grease paint, and finally a colorless translucent talcum. Siderman created the effect of skin pores on Kane's face by stippling the surface with a negative cast made from an orange peel. Welles often arrived on the set at 2:30 a.m., as application of the sculptural makeup took 3½ hours for the oldest incarnation of Kane. The makeup included appliances to age Welles's shoulders, breast, and stomach. In the film and production photographs, you can see that Kane had a belly that overhung, Siderman said. That was not a costume, it was the rubber sculpture that created the image. You could see how Kane's silk shirt clung wetly to the character's body. It could not have been done any other way. Siderman worked with Charles Wright on the wigs. These went over a flexible skull cover that Siderman created and sewed into place with elastic thread. When he found the wigs too full, he untied one hair at a time to alter their shape. Kane's mustache was inserted into the makeup surface a few hairs at a time, to realistically vary the color and texture. He also made scleral lenses for Welles, Dorothy Cummingore, George Couleris, and Everett Sloane to dull the brightness of their young eyes. The lenses took a long time to fit properly, and Siderman began work on them before devising any of the other makeup. I painted them to age in phases, ending with the blood vessels and the arcus senilis of old age. Ciderman's tour de force was the breakfast montage, shot all in one day. 12 years, 2 years shot at each scene, he said. The major studios gave screen credit for makeup only to the department head. When RKO makeup department head Mel Burns refused to share credit with Ciderman, who was only an apprentice, Wells told Burns that there would be no makeup credit. Wells signed a large advertisement in the Los Angeles newspaper. Although credited as an assistant, the film's art direction was done by Perry Ferguson. Wells and Ferguson got along during their collaboration. In the weeks before production began, Wells, Toland, and Ferguson met regularly to discuss the film and plan every shot, set design and prop. Ferguson would take notes during these discussions and create rough designs of the sets and storyboards for individual shots. After Wells approved the rough sketches, Ferguson made miniature models for Wells and Toland to experiment on with a periscope in order to rehearse and perfect each shot. Ferguson then had detailed drawings made for the set design, including the film's lighting design. The set design was an integral part of the film's overall look and Toland's cinematography. In the original script, the Great Hall at Xanadu was modeled after the Great Hall in Hearst Castle, and its design included a mixture of Renaissance and Gothic styles. The Hearstian element is brought out in the almost perverse juxtaposition of incongruous architectural styles and motifs, wrote Carringer. Before RKO cut the film's budget, Ferguson's designs were more elaborate and resembled the production designs of early Cecil B. DeMille films and Intolerance. The budget cuts reduced Ferguson's budget by 33% and his work cost $58,775 total, which was below average at that time. To save costs, Ferguson and Wells rewrote scenes in Xanadu's living room and transported them to the Great Hall. A large staircase from another film was found and used at no additional cost. When asked about the limited budget, Ferguson said, "Very often, as in that much discussed Xanadu set in Citizen Kane, we can make a foreground piece, a background piece, and imaginative lighting suggests a great deal more on the screen than actually exists on the stage." According to the film's official budget, there were 81 sets built, but Ferguson said there were between 106 and 116. Still photographs of Ahaka Castle in Huntington, New York, were used in the opening montage, representing Kane's Xanadu estate. Ferguson also designed statues from Kane's collection with styles ranging from Greek to German Gothic. 1961. The sets were also built to accommodate Toland's camera movements. Walls were built to fold and furniture could quickly be moved. The film's famous ceilings were made out of muslin fabric and camera boxes were built into the floors for low-angle shots. Wells later said that he was proud that the film production value looked much more expensive than the film's budget. Although neither worked with Wells again, Toland and Ferguson collaborated in several films in the 1940s. The film's special effects were supervised by RKO department head Vernon L. Walker. Wells pioneered several visual effects to cheaply shoot things like crowd scenes and large interior spaces. For example, the scene in which the camera in the opera house rises dramatically to the rafters, to show the workmen showing a lack of appreciation for Susan Alexander Kane's performance, was shot by a camera craning upwards over the performance scene, then a curtain wipe to a miniature of the upper regions of the house, and then another curtain wipe matching it again with the scene of the workmen. Other scenes effectively employed miniatures to make the film look much more expensive than it truly was, such as various shots of Xanadu. Some shots included rear screen projection in the background, such as Thompson's interview of Leland and some of the ocean backgrounds at Xanadu. Bordwell claims that the scene where Thatcher agrees to be Kane's guardian used rear screen projection to depict young Kane in the background, despite the scene being cited as a prime example of Toland's deep focus cinematography. A special effects camera crew from Walker's department was required for the extreme close-up shots such as Kane's lips when he says Rosebud and the shot of the typewriter typing Susan's bad review. Optical effects artist Dunn claimed that up to 80% of some reels was optically printed. These shots were traditionally attributed to Toland for years. The optical printer improved some of the deep focus shots. One problem with the optical printer was that it sometimes created excessive graininess, such as the optical zoom out of the snow globe. Wells decided to superimpose snow falling to mask the graininess in these shots. Toland said that he disliked the results of the optical printer, but acknowledged that RKO special effects expert Vernon Walker, ASC, and his staff handled their part of the production, a by no means inconsiderable assignment with ability and fine understanding. Any time deep focus was impossible, as in the scene in which Kane finishes a negative review of Susan's opera while at the same time firing the person who began writing the review. An optical printer was used to make the whole screen appear in focus, visually layering one piece of film onto another. However, some apparently deep focus shots were the result of in-camera effects, as in the famous scene in which Kane breaks into Susan's room after her suicide attempt. In the background, Kane and another man break into the room, while simultaneously the medicine bottle and a glass with a spoon in it are in close-up in the foreground. The shot was an in-camera matte shot. The foreground was shot first, with the background dark. Then the background was lit, the foreground darkened, the film rewound, and the scene reshot with the background action. Kane was the first film scored by Bernard Herrmann, who had composed for Wells's Mercury Theatre on the Air. Because it was Herrmann's first film score, RKO wanted to pay him only a small fee, but Wells insisted he be paid at the same rate as Max Steiner. Herrmann drew on radio techniques for his score. The movies frequently overlook opportunities for musical cues that last only a few seconds, that is, from 5 to 15 seconds at the most, the reason being that the eye usually covers this transition. On the other hand, in radio drama, every scene must be bridged by some sort of sound device, so that even 5 seconds of music becomes a vital instrument in telling the ear the scene is shifting. I felt that in this film, where photographic contrasts were often so sharp and sudden, a brief cue, even 2 or 3 chords, might heighten the effect immeasurably. Sound effects were often blended in Citizen Kane with the music, to add intensity to certain scenes. This was also a carryover from radio technique. The score established Herrmann as an important new film composer and eschewed the typical Hollywood practice of scoring a film with virtually non-stop music. Instead, Herrmann used what he later described as radio scoring, musical cues typically 5 to 15 seconds in length that bridge the action or suggest a different emotional response. The breakfast montage sequence begins with a graceful waltz theme and gets darker with each variation on that theme as the passage of time leads to the hardening of Kane's personality and the breakdown of his first marriage. Herrmann realized that musicians slated to play his music were hired for individual unique sessions. There was no need to write for existing ensembles. This meant that he was free to score for unusual combinations of instruments, even instruments that are not commonly heard. In the opening sequence, for example, the tour of Kane's estate Xanadu, Herrmann introduces a recurring leitmotif played by low woodwinds, including a quartet of alto flutes. For Susan Alexander Kane's operatic sequence, Wells suggested that Herrmann compose a witty parody of a merry garden vehicle, an aria from Salammbô. Our problem was to create something that would give the audience the feeling of the quicksand into which the simple little girl, having a charming but small voice, is suddenly thrown, Herrmann said. Writing in the style of a 19th-century French Oriental opera, Herrmann put the aria in a key that would force the singer to strain to reach the high notes, culminating in a high D, well outside the range of Susan Alexander. Soprano Jean Forward dubbed the vocal part for Come and Gore. Houseman claimed to have written the libretto, based on Jean Racine's Atelier and Phèdre, although some confusion remains since Lucille Fletcher remembered preparing the lyrics. Fletcher, then Herrmann's wife, wrote the libretto for his opera Wuthering Heights. Music enthusiasts consider the scene in which Susan Alexander Kane attempts to sing the famous Cavatina una voce poco fa from Il Barbiere di Siviglia by Gioacchino Rossini with vocal coach Signor Mattist as especially memorable for depicting the horrors of learning music through mistakes. Some incidental music came from other sources. Wells heard the tune used for the publisher's theme, Oh, Mr. Kane, in Mexico. Called A Poco No, the song was written by Pepe Geezer and special lyrics were written by Herman Ruby. 86 in a Ms., a 1939 jazz song by Charlie Barnett and Haven Johnson, Bookends Thompson's second interview of Susan Alexander Kane. I kind of based the whole scene around that song, Wells said. The music is by Nat Cole, it's his trio. Later beginning with the lyrics, "It can't be love in a Ms." is performed at the Everglades picnic, framing the fight in the tent between Susan and Kane. Musicians including bandleader C.P. Johnson, drums, Alton Red, vocals, Raymond Tate, trumpet, Buddy Collette, alto sax, and Buddy Banks, tenor sax, are featured. All of the music used in the newsreel came from the RKO Music Library, edited at Wells's request by the newsreel department to achieve what Herman called their own crazy way of cutting. The News on the March theme that accompanies the newsreel titles is Belgian March by Anthony Collins, from the film Nurse Edith Cavell. Other examples are an excerpt from Alfred Newman's score for Gunga Din, The Exploration of Xanadu, Roy Webb's theme for Reno, The Growth of Kane's Empire, and bits of Webb's score for Five Came Back, introducing Walter Parks Thatcher. Herman concluded that 2 full weeks were spent in the dubbing room, and music under our supervision was often re-recorded 6 or 7 times before the proper dynamic level was achieved. The result is an exact projection of the original musical ideas in the score. Technically, no composer could ask for more. I am not a great believer in the leitmotif as a device for motion picture music, but in this film its use was practically imperative, because of the story itself and the manner in which it is unfolded. There are 2 main motifs. One, a simple 4-note figure in the brass, is that of Kane's power. It is given out in the first 2 bars of the film. The second motif is that of Rosebud. Heard as a solo in the vibraphone, it first appears in the death scene at the very beginning of the picture. It is heard again and again throughout the film in various guises, and if followed closely, is a clue to the ultimate identity of Rosebud itself. The motif of power is also transformed, becoming a vigorous piece of ragtime, a hornpipe polka, and, at the end of the picture, a commentary on Kane's life. In 1972, Herman said, "I was fortunate to start my career with a film like Citizen Kane. It's been a downhill run ever since." Wells loved Herman's score and told director Henry Jaglom that it was 50% responsible for the film's artistic success. One of the editing techniques used in Citizen Kane was the use of montage to collapse time and space, using an episodic sequence on the same set while the characters changed costume and makeup between cuts so that the scene following each cut would look as if it took place in the same location, but at a time long after the previous cut. In the breakfast montage, Wells chronicles the breakdown of Kane's first marriage in 5 vignettes that condense 16 years of story time into 2 minutes of screen time. Wells said that the idea for the breakfast scene was stolen from The Long Christmas Dinner by Thornton Wilder, a 1-act play, which is a long Christmas dinner that takes you through something like 60 years of a family's life. The film often uses long dissolves to signify the passage of time and its psychological effect of the characters, such as the scene in which the abandoned sled is covered with snow after the young Kane is sent away with that. Charwells was influenced by the editing theories of Sergei Eisenstein by using jarring cuts that caused sudden graphic or associative contrasts, such as the cut from Kane's deathbed to the beginning of the News on the March sequence and a sudden shot of a shrieking cockatoo at the beginning of Raymond's flashback. Although the film typically favors mise en scene over montage, the scene in which Kane goes to Susan Alexander's apartment after first meeting her is the only one that is primarily cut as close-ups with shots and counter shots between Kane and Susan. Fabe says that by using a standard Hollywood technique sparingly, Wells revitalizes its psychological expressiveness. Wells never confirmed a principal source for the character of Charles Foster Kane. Houseman wrote that Kane is a synthesis of different personalities, with Hearst's life used as the main source. Some events and details were invented, and Houseman wrote that he and Mankiewicz also grafted anecdotes from other giants of journalism, including Pulitzer, Northcliffe, and Mank's first boss, Herbert Bayard Swope. Wells said, "Mr. Hearst was quite a bit like Kane, although Kane isn't really founded on Hearst in particular. Many people sat for it, so to speak. He specifically acknowledged that aspects of Kane were drawn from the lives of two business tycoons familiar from his youth in Chicago, Samuel Insull and Harold Fowler McCormick. The character of Jedediah Leland was based on drama critic Ashton Stevens, George Stevens's uncle and Wells's close boyhood friend. Some detail came from Mankiewicz's own experience as a drama critic in New York. Many assumed that the character of Susan Alexander Kane was based on Marion Davies, Hearst's mistress whose career he managed. This assumption was a major reason Hearst tried to destroy Citizen Kane. Wells denied that the character was based on Davies, whom he called an extraordinary woman, nothing like the character Dorothy Cummingore played in the movie. He cited Insull's building of the Chicago Opera House, and McCormick's lavish promotion of the opera career of his second wife, Gunna Walska, as direct influences on the screenplay. The character of political boss Jim W. Geddes is based on Charles F. Murphy, a leader in New York City's infamous Tammany Hall political machine. Wells credited Rosebud to Mankiewicz. Biographer Richard Merriman wrote that the symbol of Mankiewicz's own damaged childhood was a treasured bicycle, stolen while he visited the public library and not replaced by his family as punishment. He regarded it as the prototype of Charles Foster Kane's sled. In his 2015 Wells biography, Patrick McGilligan reported that Mankiewicz himself stated that the word Rosebud was taken from the name of a famous racehorse, Old Rosebud. Mankiewicz had a bet on the horse in the 1914 Kentucky Derby, which he won, and McGilligan wrote that Old Rosebud symbolized his lost youth, and the break with his family. In testimony for a copyright infringement suit brought by Hearst biographer Ferdinand Lundberg, Mankiewicz said, "I had undergone psychoanalysis, and Rosebud, under circumstances slightly resembling the circumstances in Citizen Kane, played a prominent part." Gore. Vidal has argued in the New York Review of Books that Rosebud was what Hearst called his friend Marion Davies's clitoris. The News on the March sequence that begins the film satirizes the journalistic style of The March of Time, the news documentary and dramatization series presented in movie theaters by Time Inc. From 1935 to 1938, Wells was a member of the uncredited company of actors that presented the original radio version. Houseman claimed that banker Walter P. Thatcher was loosely based on J.P. Morgan. Bernstein was named for Dr. Maurice Bernstein, appointed Wells's guardian. Sloane's portrayal was said to be based on Bernard Herrmann. Herbert Carter, editor of The Inquirer, was named for actor Jack Carter. Laura Mulvey explored the anti-fascist themes of Citizen Kane in her 1992 monograph for the British Film Institute. The News on the March newsreel presents Kane keeping company with Hitler and other dictators while he smugly assures the public that there will be no war. She wrote that the film reflects the battle between intervention and isolationism then being waged in the United States. The film was released 6 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, while President Franklin D. Roosevelt was laboring to win public opinion for entering World War II. In the rhetoric of Citizen Kane, Mulvey writes, "The destiny of isolationism is realized in metaphor, in Kane's own fate, dying wealthy and lonely, surrounded by the detritus of European culture and history." Journalist Ignacio Reymanit has cited the film as an early example of mass media manipulation of public opinion and the power that media conglomerates have on influencing the democratic process. He believes that this early example of a media mogul influencing politics is outdated and that today there are media groups with the power of 1,000 Citizen Kanes. Media mogul Rupert Murdoch is sometimes labeled as a latter-day Citizen Kane. Comparisons have also been made between the career and character of Donald Trump and Charles Foster Kane. Citizen Kane is reported to be one of Trump's favorite films, and his biographer Tim O'Brien has said that Trump is fascinated by and identifies with Kane. To ensure that Hearst's life's influence on Citizen Kane was a secret, Wells limited access to dailies and managed the film's publicity. A December 1940 feature story in Stage magazine compared the film's narrative to Faust and made no mention of Hearst. The film was scheduled to premiere at RKO's flagship theater Radio City Music Hall on February 14, but in early January 1941 Wells was not finished with post-production work and told RKO that it still needed its musical score. Writers for national magazines had early deadlines, and so a rough cut was previewed for a select few on January 3, for such magazines as Life, Look and Red Book. Gossip columnist Hedda Hopper, an arch-rival of Luella Parsons, the Hollywood correspondent for Hearst Papers, showed up to the screening uninvited. Most of the critics at the preview said that they liked the film and gave it good advanced reviews. Hopper wrote negatively about it, calling the film a vicious and irresponsible attack on a great man and criticizing its corny writing and old-fashioned photography. Friday magazine ran an article drawing point-by-point comparisons between Kane and Hearst and documented how Wells had led on Parsons. Up until this, Wells had been friendly with Parsons. The magazine quoted Wells as saying that he could not understand why she was so nice to him and that she should wait until the woman finds out that the picture's about her boss. Wells immediately denied making the statement, and the editor of Friday admitted that it might be false. Wells apologized to Parsons and assured her that he had never made that remark. Shortly after Friday's article, Hearst sent Parsons an angry letter complaining that he had learned about Citizen Kane from Hopper and not her. The incident made a fool of Parsons and compelled her to start attacking Wells and the film. Parsons demanded a private screening of the film and personally threatened Schaefer on Hearst's behalf, first with a lawsuit and then with a vague threat of consequences for everyone in Hollywood. On January 10, Parsons and two lawyers working for Hearst were given a private screening of the film. 206 James G. Stewart was present at the screening and said that she walked out of the film. Soon after, Parsons called Schaefer and threatened RKO with a lawsuit if they released Kane. She also contacted the management of Radio City Music Hall and demanded that they should not screen it. The next day, the front page headline in Daily Variety read, "Hearst bans RKO from papers." Hearst began this ban by suppressing promotion of RKO's Kitty Foyle, but in 2 weeks the ban was lifted for everything except Kane. When Schaefer did not submit to Parsons, she called other studio heads and made more threats on behalf of Hearst to expose the private lives of people throughout the entire film industry. Wells was then threatened with an exposé about his romance with the married actress Dolores Del Rio, who wanted the affair kept secret until her divorce was finalized. In a statement to journalists, Wells denied that the film was about Hearst. Hearst began preparing an injunction against the film for libel and invasion of privacy, but Wells's lawyer told him that he doubted Hearst would proceed due to the negative publicity and required testimony that an injunction would bring. The Hollywood Reporter ran a front-page story on January 13 that Hearst Papers were about to run a series of editorials attacking Hollywood's practice of hiring refugees and immigrants for jobs that could be done by Americans. The goal was to put pressure on the other studios to force RKO to shelve Kane. Many of those immigrants had fled Europe after the rise of fascism and feared losing the haven of the United States. Soon afterwards, Schaefer was approached by Nicholas Schenck, head of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's parent company, with an offer on the behalf of Louis B. Mayer and other Hollywood executives to RKO Pictures of $805,000 to destroy all prints of the film and burn the negative. Once RKO's legal team reassured Schaefer, the studio announced on January 21 that Kane would be released as scheduled, and with one of the largest promotional campaigns in the studio's history. Schaefer brought Wells to New York City for a private screening of the film with the New York corporate heads of the studios and their lawyers. There was no objection to its release provided that certain changes, including the removal or softening of specific references that might offend Hearst, were made. Wells agreed and cut the running time from 122 minutes to 119 minutes. The cut satisfied the corporate lawyers. The trailer contains the only existing behind-the-scenes footage of the film. Wells narrates a tour around the film set, introduces the principal cast members, and offers a brief overview of Kane's character. While Citizen Kane is frequently cited as a groundbreaking, influential film, Simon Callow argues its trailer was no less original in its approach. Callow writes that it has great playful charm, it is a miniature documentary, almost an introduction to the cinema. Teasing, charming, completely original, it is a sort of conjuring trick, without his face appearing once on the screen. Wells entirely dominates its 5-6 minutes duration. Radio City Music Hall's management refused to screen Citizen Kane for its premiere. A possible factor was Parsons's threat that the American Weekly would run a defamatory story on the grandfather of major RKO stockholder Nelson Rockefeller. Other exhibitors feared being sued for libel by Hearst and refused to show the film. In March, Wells threatened the RKO Board of Governors with a lawsuit if they did not release the film. Schaefer stood by Wells and opposed the Board of Governors. When RKO still delayed the film's release, Wells offered to buy the film for $1 million and the studio finally agreed to release the film on May. Schaefer managed to book a few theaters willing to show the film. Hearst papers refused to accept advertising. RKO's publicity advertisements for the film erroneously promoted it as a love story. Kane opened at the RKO Palace Theater on Broadway in New York on May 1, 1941, in Chicago on May 6, and in Los Angeles on May. Wells said that at the Chicago premiere that he attended, the theater was almost empty. Reviews fell into three categories: great, mixed, and negative. The day following the premiere of Citizen Kane, the New York Times critic Bosley Crowther wrote that it comes close to being the most sensational film ever made in Hollywood. Count on Mr. Wells, he doesn't do things by halves. Upon the screen he discovered an area large enough for his expansive whims to have free play. And the consequence is that he has made a picture of tremendous and overpowering scope, not in physical extent so much as in its rapid and graphic rotation of thoughts. Mr. Wells has put upon the screen a motion picture that really moves. Cecilia Ager, reviewing it in PM, wrote, "Seeing it, it's as if you never really saw a movie before." The Washington Post called it one of the most important films in the history of filmmaking. The Washington Evening Star said Wells was a genius who created a superbly dramatic biography of another genius and a picture that is revolutionary. New York Daily News critic Kate Cameron called it one of the most interesting and technically superior films that has ever come out of a Hollywood studio. New York World Telegram critic William Bainell said that the film was staggering and belongs at once among the greatest screen achievements. Time magazine wrote that it has found important new techniques in picture making and storytelling. Life magazine's review said that few movies have ever come from Hollywood with such powerful narrative, such original technique, such exciting photography. John C. Mosier of The New Yorker called the film's style like fresh air and raved something new has come to the movie world at last. Anthony Bauer of The Nation called it brilliant and praised the cinematography and performances by Wells, Gore, and Cotten. John O'Hara's Newsweek review called it the best picture he'd ever seen and said Wells was the best actor in the history of acting. Wells called O'Hara's review the greatest review that anybody ever had. In the UK, C.A. Lejeune of The Observer called it the most exciting film that has come out of Hollywood in 25 years, and Dilys Powell of the Sunday Times said the film's style was made with the ease and boldness and resource of one who controls and is not controlled by his medium. Edward Tanguy Lean of Horizon praised the film's technical style, calling it perhaps a decade ahead of its contemporaries. Other reviews were mixed. Edwin Shallert of the Los Angeles Times said it was brilliant and skillful at times, but had an ending that rather fizzled. The Chicago Tribune called the film interesting and different, but its sacrifice of simplicity to eccentricity robs it of distinction and general entertainment value. Otis Ferguson of the New Republic said it was the boldest freehand stroke in major screen production since Griffith and Bitzer were running wild to unshackle the camera, but also criticized its style, calling it a retrogression in film technique and stating that it holds no great place in film history. Ferguson reacted to some of the film's celebrated visual techniques by calling them just willful dabbling and the old shell game. In a rare film review, filmmaker Eric von Stroheim criticized the film's story and nonlinear structure, but praised the technical style and performances, and wrote, "Whatever the truth may be about it, Citizen Kane is a great picture and will go down in screen history." More power to Wells. Some prominent critics wrote negative reviews. None of them dismissed the film as being altogether bad, noting the film's undeniable technical effects, but they did find fault with the narrative. Eileen Creelman of the New York Sun called it a cold picture, unemotional, a puzzle rather than a drama. In his 1941 review for Sir Jorge Luis Borges famously called the film a labyrinth with no center and predicted that its legacy would be a film whose historical value is undeniable but which no one cares to see again. The Argus Weekend magazine critic Oral Cox called the film amazing but thought that Wells's break with Hollywood traditions was overdone. Tatler's James Agate called it the well-intentioned, muddled, amateurish thing one expects from highbrows. He admitted that it was a quite good film but insisted that it tries to run the psychological essay in harness with your detective thriller, and doesn't quite succeed. Other people who disliked the film were W. H. Auden and James Agee. After watching the film on January 29, 1942, future British star Kenneth Williams, then aged 15, curtly described the film in his first diary as Bosche Rot. The film did well in cities and larger towns, but it fared poorly in more remote areas. RKO still had problems getting exhibitors to show the film. For example, one chain controlling more than 500 theaters got Wells's film as part of a package but refused to play it, reportedly out of fear of Hearst. Hearst's disruption of the film's release damaged its box office performance and, as a result, it lost $160,000 during its initial run. The film earned $23,878 during its first week in New York. By the ninth week it only made $7,279. Overall it lost money in New York, Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C., but made a profit in Seattle. Moviegoers who saw the picture generally spread negative word of mouth among their neighbors, and exhibitors in the United States and Canada were not shy about voicing their reactions, as published in Motion Picture Herald. A few theater owners were discerning, recognizing the startling new techniques but conceding the poor box office performance is likely to make your auditorium resound from vacuousness like the giant stone walls in Kane's Incredible Castle. Box office or no box office, this unusual film is without doubt a step toward elevating the artistic plane of the motion picture in general. 131A. College Town exhibitor reported, "I thought it was fine, as did the majority of people who attended the performances. However, there were some who either did not like it or did not get it. Business was just average. Don't try to tell me Orson Welles isn't a genius. Herein he has produced a mighty fine picture, and herewith he has established for me the lowest gross that I have ever experienced. I would have sworn that such ridiculous receipts were utterly impossible. If you cater to film connoisseurs, this picture is made for you. But me, I heard all over. Others were more blunt. Nobody liked this and said so. We took in just enough to pay for it, so considered ourselves very lucky. 1 day after showing this we still feel hesitant about walking abroad without an escort. Half of the few dozen that paid to see this masterpiece walked out, and the other half remained only to think up new dirty cracks to cast in our direction on the way out. High-priced picture. But I made a little money on my help. They took off 3 days because they were afraid of being all alone in the theater. You can stand in front of a mirror and call yourself sucker when you play this one. It does not have one redeeming feature. It will not draw, those that do come will not know what it is all about. A Minnesota exhibitor summed up the situation for rural areas. My patrons still don't know what it was all about. Too long and too deep. No box office value to small towns. Hearing about Citizen Kane enraged Hearst so much that he banned any advertising, reviewing, or mentioning of it in his papers, and had his journalists libel Welles. Welles used Hearst's opposition as a pretext for previewing the film in several opinion-making screenings in Los Angeles, lobbying for its artistic worth against the hostile campaign that Hearst was waging. A special press screening took place in early March. Henry Luce was in attendance and reportedly wanted to buy the film from RKO for $1 million to distribute it himself. The reviews for this screening were positive. A Hollywood Review headline read, "Mr. Genius comes through, Kane astonishing picture." The Motion Picture Herald reported about the screening and Hearst's intention to sue RKO. Time wrote that the objection of Mr. Hearst, who founded a publishing empire on sensationalism, is ironic. For to most of the several hundred people who have seen the film at private screenings, Citizen Kane is the most sensational product of the US movie industry. A second press screening occurred in April. When Schaefer rejected Hearst's offer to suppress the film, Hearst banned every newspaper and station in his media conglomerate from reviewing or even mentioning the film. He also had many movie theaters ban it, and many did not show it through fear of being socially exposed by his massive newspaper empire. The Oscar-nominated documentary The Battle Over Citizen Kane solely blames the failure of Citizen Kane on Hearst's actions. The film did decent business at the box office. It went on to be the sixth highest grossing film in its year of release, a modest success its backers found acceptable. Nevertheless, the film's commercial performance fell short of its creators' expectations. Hearst's biographer David Nassau points out that Hearst's actions were not the only reason Kane failed. However, the innovations Wells made with narrative, as well as the dark message at the heart of the film, that the pursuit of success is ultimately futile, meant that a popular audience could not appreciate its merits. Hearst's attacks against Wells went beyond attempting to suppress the film. Wells said that while he was on his post-filming lecture tour, a police detective approached him at a restaurant and advised him not to go back to his hotel. A 14-year-old girl had reportedly been hidden in the closet of his room, and 2 photographers were waiting for him to walk in. Knowing he would be jailed after the resulting publicity, Wells did not return to the hotel but waited until the train left town the following morning. But that wasn't Hearst, Wells said. That was a hatchet man from the local Hearst paper who thought he would advance himself by doing it. In March 1941, Wells directed a Broadway version of Richard Wright's Native Son, and, for luck, used a rosebud sled as a prop. Native Son received positive reviews, but Hearst-owned papers used the opportunity to attack Wells as a communist. The Hearst papers vociferously attacked Wells after his April 1941 radio play, His Honor, the Mayor, produced for the Free Company radio series on CBS. Wells described his chance encounter with Hearst in an elevator at the Fairmont Hotel on the night Citizen Kane opened in San Francisco. Hearst and Wells's father were acquaintances, so Wells introduced himself and asked Hearst if he would like to come to the opening. Hearst did not respond. As he was getting off at his floor, I said, "Charles Foster Kane would have accepted." No reply, recalled Wells. And Kane would have, you know. That was his style, just as he finished Jed Leland's bad review of Susan as an opera singer. In 1945, Hearst journalist Robert Shaw wrote that the film got a full tide of insensate fury from Hearst papers, then it ebbed suddenly. With one brain cell working, the chief realized that such hysterical barking by the trained seals would attract too much attention to the picture. But to this day the name of Orson Welles is on the official son of a bitch list of every Hearst newspaper. Despite Hearst's attempts to destroy the film, since 1941 references to his life and career have usually included a reference to Citizen Kane, such as the headline "Son of Citizen Kane dies" for the obituary of Hearst's son. In 2012, the Hearst estate agreed to screen the film at Hearst Castle in San Simeon, breaking Hearst's ban on the film. Modern critics have given Citizen Kane an even more positive response. Review aggregation website Rotten Tomatoes reports that 99% of 133 critics gave the film a positive review, with an average rating of 9.90/10. In April 2021, it was noted that the addition of an 80-year-old negative review from the Chicago Tribune reduced the film's rating from 100% to 99% on the site. Citizen Kane held its 100% rating until early 2021. On Metacritic, however, the film still has a very rare weighted average score of 100 out of 100 based on 19 critics, indicating universal acclaim. The film was included by the Vatican in a list of important films compiled in 1995, under the category of art. 148. The February 2020 issue of New York Magazine lists Citizen Kane as among the best movies that lost Best Picture at the Oscars. Roger Ebert wrote of it, "Its surface is as much fun as any movie ever made. Its depths surpass understanding. I have analyzed it a shot at a time with more than 30 groups, and together we have seen, I believe, pretty much everything that is there on the screen. The more clearly I can see its physical manifestation, the more I am stirred by its mystery." Citizen Kane was the only film made under Wells's original contract with RKO Pictures, which gave him complete creative control. 223. Wells's new business manager and attorney permitted the contract to lapse. In July 1941, Wells reluctantly signed a new and less favorable deal with RKO 223, under which he produced and directed The Magnificent Ambersons, 1942, produced Journey into Fear, 1943, and began It's All True, a film he agreed to do without payment. In the new contract, Wells was an employee of the studio and lost the right to Final Cut, which later allowed RKO to modify and recut The Magnificent Ambersons over his objections. 223. In June 1942, Schaefer resigned the presidency of RKO Pictures and Wells's contract was terminated by his successor. The European release of Kane was delayed until after World War II, premiering in Paris in 1946. Initial reception by French critics was influenced by negative views from Jean-Paul Sartre and Georges Seydoux, who criticized Hollywood's cultural sophistication and the film's nostalgic use of flashbacks. However, critic André Bazin delivered a transformative speech in 1946 that shifted public opinion. Bazin praised the film for its innovative use of mise-en-scène and deep-focus cinematography, advocating for a filmic realism that allows audiences to engage more actively with the narrative. Bazin's essays, especially The Technique of Citizen Kane, played a crucial role in enhancing the film's reputation, arguing it revolutionized film language and aesthetics. His defense of Citizen Kane as a work of art influenced other critics and contributed to a broader re-evaluation of the film in Europe and the United States. In the US, the film was initially neglected until it began appearing on television in the 1950s and was re-released in theaters. American film critic Andrew Sarris was significant in reviving its reputation, describing it as a profoundly influential American film. Over the decades, Citizen Kane has been consistently ranked highly in critical surveys and polls, often cited as the greatest film ever made. The film's narrative structure, cinematography, and themes have influenced countless filmmakers and films worldwide, asserting its place as a cornerstone in the history of cinema. Martin Scorsese recalls, "I saw Citizen Kane on TV, and I began to become aware of editing and camera positions." Wells was not afraid of being self-conscious with the camera and making self-referential remarks with the camera. Steven Spielberg says it means everything to me. It is an icon of courage, it's about courage and audacity, and I'm making this my way, and I'm going to make this my way, and I'm going to deepen the focus, we're going to see from 1 inch to infinity in every shot, and we're going to see ceilings, and we're going to tell a very convoluted mystery story about a man's life. It is just one of the greatest movies ever made. In 1982, Spielberg bought one of the prop sleds from Citizen Kane. Spielberg called Kane the most classic movie ever made, and the sled a symbolic emblem of quality in the film business. Citizen Kane knows that the sled is not the answer. It explains what Rosebud is, but not what Rosebud means. The film's construction shows how our lives, after we're gone, survive only in the memories of others, and those memories butt up against the walls we erect and the roles we play. There is the Kane who made shadow figures with his fingers, and the Kane who hated the Traction Trust, the Kane who chose his mistress over his marriage and political career, the Kane who entertained millions, the Kane who died alone. There is a master image in Citizen Kane that you might easily miss. The tycoon has overextended himself and is losing control of his empire. After he signs the papers of his surrender, he turns and walks into the back of the shot. Deep focus allows Wells to play a trick of perspective. Behind Kane on the wall is a window that seems to be of ordinary size. but as he walks towards it, we see it is farther away and much higher than we thought. Eventually he stands beneath its lower sill, shrunken and diminished. Then as he walks towards us, his stature grows again. A man always seems the same size to himself, because he does not stand where we stand when we look at him. The composite camera negative of Citizen Kane is believed to be lost forever. The most commonly reported explanation is that it was destroyed in a New Jersey film laboratory fire in the 1970s. However, in 2021, Nicholas Falaxi revealed that he had been told the real story by a colleague, when he was one of 2 employees in the film restoration lab which assembled the 1991 restoration from the best available elements. Falaxi noted that throughout the process he had daily visits in 1990 to 91 from an unnamed older RKO executive showing up every day, nervous and sweating. According to Falaxi's colleague, this elderly man was keen to cover up a clerical error he had made decades earlier when in charge of the studio's inventory, which had resulted in the original camera negatives being sent to a silver reclamation plant, destroying the nitrate film to extract its valuable silver content. Falaxi's account is impossible to verify, but it would have been fully in keeping with industry standard practice for many decades, which was to destroy prints and negatives of countless older films deemed non-commercially viable, to extract the silver. Subsequent prints were derived from a master positive, a fine-grain preservation element, made in the 1940s and originally intended for use in overseas distribution. Modern techniques were used to produce a pristine print for a 50th anniversary theatrical reissue in 1991 which Paramount Pictures released for then-owner Turner Broadcasting System, which earned $1.6 million in North America and $1.8 million worldwide. In 1955, RKO sold the American television rights to its film library, including Citizen Kane, to C&C Television Corp. In 1960, television rights to the pre-1959 RKO's live-action library were acquired by United Artists. RKO kept the non-broadcast television rights to its library. In 1976, when home video was in its infancy, entrepreneur Snuff Garrett bought cassette rights to the RKO library for what United Press International termed a pittance. In 1978 the Nostalgia Merchant released the film through Media Home Entertainment. By 1980 the 800-title library of the Nostalgia Merchant was earning $2.3 million a year. Nobody wanted cassettes 4 years ago, Garrett told UPI. It wasn't the first time people called me crazy. It was a hobby with me which became big business. RKO Home Video released the film on VHS and Betamax in 1985. On December 3, 1984, the Criterion Collection released the film as its first laserdisc. It was made from a fine-grain master positive provided by the UCLA Film and Television Archive. When told about the then new concept of having an audio commentary on the disc, Wells was skeptical but said theoretically, "That's good for teaching movies, so long as they don't talk nonsense." 283 in 1992 Criterion released a new 50th anniversary edition Laserdisc. This version had an improved transfer and additional special features, including the documentary The Legacy of Citizen Kane and Wells's early short The Hearts of Age. Turner Broadcasting System acquired broadcast television rights to the RKO library in 1986 and the full worldwide rights to the library in 1987. The RKO home video unit was reorganized into Turner Home Entertainment that year. 176 in 1991 Turner released a 50th anniversary edition on VHS and as a collector's edition that includes the film, the documentary Reflections on Citizen Kane, Harlan Lebo's 50th anniversary album, a poster, and a copy of the original script. In 1996, Time Warner acquired Turner and Warner Home Video absorbed Turner Home Entertainment. In 2011, Time Warner's Warner Brothers unit had distribution rights for the film. In 2001, Warner Home Video released a 60th anniversary collector's edition DVD. The 2-disc DVD included feature-length commentaries by Roger Ebert and Peter Bogdanovich, as well as a second DVD with the feature-length documentary The Battle Over Citizen Kane, 1999. It was simultaneously released on VHS. The DVD was criticized for being too bright, too clean. The dirt and grime had been cleared away, but so had a good deal of the texture, the depth, and the sense of film grain. In 2003, Wells's daughter Beatrice Wells sued Turner Entertainment, claiming the Wells estate is the legal copyright holder of the film. She claimed that Wells's deal to terminate his contracts with RKO meant that Turner's copyright of the film was null and void. She also claimed that the estate of Orson Welles was owed 20% of the film's profits if her copyright claim was not upheld. In 2007 she was allowed to proceed with the lawsuit, overturning the 2004 decision in favor of Turner Entertainment on the issue of video rights. In 2011, it was released on Blu-ray and DVD in a 70th anniversary edition. 184 It was called the Blu-ray release of the year by the San Francisco Chronicle, ironically owned by the Hearst family at this point. Supplements included everything available on the 2001 Warner Home Video release, including the Battle Over Citizen Kane DVD. A 70th Anniversary Ultimate Collector's Edition added a third DVD with RKO 281, 1999, an award-winning TV movie about the making of the film. Its packaging extras included a hardcover book and a folio containing many reproductions of the original souvenir program, lobby cards, and production memos and correspondence. The transfer for the US releases were scanned as 4K resolution from 3 different 35mm prints and rectified the quality issues of the 2001 DVD. The rest of the world continued to receive home video releases based on the older transfer. This was partially rectified in 2016 with the release of the 75th Anniversary Edition in both the UK and US, which was a straight repackaging of the main disc from the 70th Anniversary Edition. On August 11, 2021, Criterion announced their first Ultra HD Blu-ray releases. A 6-film slate would include Citizen Kane. Criterion indicated each title was to be available in a combo pack including a 4K UHD disc of the feature film as well as the film and special features on the companion Blu-rays. Citizen Kane was released on November 23, 2021, as a 4K and 3 Blu-ray disc package. However, the release was recalled because at the half-hour mark on the regular Blu-ray, the contrast fell sharply, which resulted in a much darker image than what was supposed to occur. However, this issue does not affect the 4K disc. In the 1980s, Citizen Kane became a catalyst in the controversy over the colorization of black and white films. One proponent of film colorization was Ted Turner, whose Turner Entertainment Company owned the RKO library. A Turner Entertainment spokesperson initially stated that Citizen Kane would not be colorized, but in July 1988 Turner said, "Citizen Kane? I'm thinking of colorizing it." In early 1989 it was reported that 2 companies were producing color tests for Turner Entertainment. Criticism increased when filmmaker Henry Jaglom stated that shortly before his death Wells had implored him, "Don't let Ted Turner deface my movie with his crayons." In February 1989, Turner Entertainment president Roger Meyer announced that work to colorize the film had been stopped due to provisions in Wells's 1939 contract with RKO that could be read to prohibit colorization without permission of the Wells estate. Meyer added that Wells's contract was quite unusual and other contracts we have checked out are not like this at all. Turner had only colorized the final reel of the film before abandoning the project. In 1991 1 minute of the colorized test footage was included in the BBC Arena documentary The Complete Citizen Kane. The colorization controversy was a factor in the passage of the National Film Preservation Act in 1988 which created the National Film Registry the following year. ABC News anchor Peter Jennings reported that one major reason for doing this is to require people like the broadcaster Ted Turner, who's been adding color to some movies and re-editing others for television, to put notices on those versions saying that the movies have been altered. Citizen Kane, that quintessential American film, the one crowned the best movie ever by critics and viewers alike, returns to the screen in celebration of its 50th anniversary. From its fabled deathbed whispering of Rosebud to its staccato march of time-like recounting of Charles Kane's dramatic life, Citizen Kane delivers. While Citizen Kane purportedly tells the story of newspaperman Charles Kane, it is also the thinly veiled story of media mogul, William Randolph Hearst. In addition, Citizen Kane turns out to be the film directorial debut of Orson Welles and his impressive genius. As the picture opens, Charles Kane lies dying in his fabulous castle, the castle called Xanadu, shades of Kublai Khan, surrounded by his vast treasures. Then, as his eyes close in death, he utters one word, Rosebud. Suddenly, the death scene is broken, and the screen becomes alive as the media rehearses Kane's life from his humble beginnings to his great wealth and power. It tells how he became a newspaper publisher as a young man, how he aspired to political office but was defeated because of personal scandal, how he devoted himself to material acquisition, and how he finally died. However, the story behind the story begins when a news editor probes to discover the secret of Kane's strange nature, and especially what he meant by Rosebud. Thus, a reporter is dispatched to interview those closest to Kane, his boyhood guardian, 2 newspaper associates, and his mistress. They each agree that Kane was a titanic egomaniac who was consumed, in some way, by his terrifying selfishness. As to what drives Kane and whether he is villain or social parasite, never becomes clear. Even the final, poignant identification of Rosebud accomplishes little save to add a sentimental, human touch to Kane. The significance of Citizen Kane lies in the way the tale is told, the magical camera work, the deep focus photography, the seamless transitions from scene to scene, the abundance of imagistic details that serve to flesh out Kane's character, and finally, the expose of Kane's, and Hearst's, yellow journalistic practices. The conclusion of the matter: don't miss this great film. In its cynicism, irony, oppressiveness, and realism, it drives home the words of Jesus, "For what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" Mark 8:36. It is interesting to note that throughout his career, Orson Welles peppered his profound insights with biblical quotes and references. Why he did so is a question which may not be answered until we stand before the truth who will answer all our questions. "I don't think any word can explain a man's life," says one of the searchers through the warehouse of treasures left behind by Charles Foster Kane. Then we get the famous series of shots leading to the close-up of the word Rosebud on a sled that has been tossed into a furnace, its paint curling in the flames. We remember that this was Kane's childhood sled, taken from him as he was torn from his family and sent east to boarding school. Rosebud is the emblem of the security, hope and innocence of childhood, which a man can spend his life seeking to regain. It is the green light at the end of Gatsby's Pier, the leopard atop Kilimanjaro, seeking nobody knows what, the bone tossed into the air in 2001. It is that yearning after transience that adults learn to suppress. Maybe Rosebud was something he couldn't get, or something he lost, says Thompson, the reporter assigned to the puzzle of Kane's dying word. Anyway, it wouldn't have explained anything. True, it explains nothing, but it is remarkably satisfactory as a demonstration that nothing can be explained. Citizen Kane likes playful paradoxes like that. Its surface is as much fun as any movie ever made. Its depths surpass understanding. I have analyzed it a shot at a time with more than 30 groups, and together we have seen, I believe, pretty much everything that is there on the screen. The more clearly I can see its physical manifestation, the more I am stirred by its mystery. It is one of the miracles of cinema that in 1941 a first-time director, a cynical, hard-drinking writer, an innovative cinematographer, and a group of New York stage and radio actors were given the keys to a studio and total control, and made a masterpiece. Citizen Kane is more than a great movie, it is a gathering of all the lessons of the emerging era of sound, just as Birth of a Nation assembled everything learned at the summit of the silent era, and 2001 pointed the way beyond narrative. These peaks stand above all the others. The origins of Citizen Kane are well known. Orson Welles, the boy wonder of radio and stage, was given freedom by RKO Radio Pictures to make any picture he wished. Herman Mankiewicz, an experienced screenwriter, collaborated with him on a screenplay originally called The American. Its inspiration was the life of William Randolph Hearst, who had put together an empire of newspapers, radio stations, magazines, and news services, and then built to himself the flamboyant monument of San Simeon, a castle furnished by rummaging the remains of nations. Hearst was Ted Turner, Rupert Murdoch, and Bill Gates rolled up into an enigma. Arriving in Hollywood at age 25, Welles brought a subtle knowledge of sound and dialogue along with him. On his Mercury Theater of the Air, he'd experimented with audio styles more lithe and suggestive than those usually heard in the movies. As his cinematographer he hired Greg Toland, who on John Ford's The Long Voyage Home, 1940, had experimented with deep focus photography, with shots where everything was in focus, from the front to the back, so that composition and movement determined where the eye looked first. For his cast Welles assembled his New York colleagues, including Joseph Cotten as Jed Leland, the hero's best friend, Dorothy Cumming Gore as Susan Alexander, the young woman Kane thought he could make into an opera star, Everett Sloane as Mr. Bernstein, the mogul's business wizard, Ray Collins as Geddes, the corrupt political boss, and Agnes Moorehead as the boy's forbidding mother. Welles himself played Kane from age 25 until his deathbed, using makeup and body language to trace the progress of a man increasingly captive inside his needs. All he really wanted out of life was love, Leland says. That's Charlie's story, how he lost it. The structure of Citizen Kane is circular, adding more depth every time it passes over the life. The movie opens with newsreel obituary footage that briefs us on the life and times of Charles Foster Kane. This footage, with its portentous narration, is Welles' bemused nod in the direction of the March of Time newsreels then being produced by another media mogul, Henry Luce. They provide a map of Kane's trajectory, and it will keep us oriented as the screenplay skips around in time, piecing together the memories of those who knew him. Curious about Kane's dying word, Rosebud, the newsreel editor assigns Thompson, a reporter, to find out what it meant. Thompson is played by William Alland in a thankless performance. He triggers every flashback, yet his face is never seen. He questions Kane's alcoholic mistress, his ailing old friend, his rich associate and the other witnesses, while the movie loops through time. As often as I've seen Citizen Kane, I've never been able to firmly fix the order of the scenes in my mind. I look at a scene and tease myself with what will come next. But it remains elusive. By flashing back through the eyes of many witnesses, Welles and Mankiewicz created an emotional chronology set free from time. The movie is filled with bravura visual moments, the towers of Xanadu, candidate Kane addressing a political rally, the doorway of his mistress dissolving into a front-page photo in a rival newspaper, the cameras swooping down through a skylight toward the pathetic Susan in a nightclub, the many Kanes reflected through parallel mirrors, the boy playing in the snow in the background as his parents determine his future, the great shot as the camera rises straight up from Susan's opera debut to a stagehand holding his nose, and the subsequent shot of Kane, his face hidden in shadow, defiantly applauding in the silent hall. Along with the personal story is the history of a period. Citizen Kane covers the rise of the penny press. Here Joseph Pulitzer is the model, the Hearst-supported Spanish-American War, the birth of radio, the power of political machines, the rise of fascism, the growth of celebrity journalism. A newsreel subtitle reads, 1895 to 1941. All of these years he covered, many of these he was. The screenplay by Mankiewicz and Welles, which got an Oscar, the only one Welles ever won, is densely constructed and covers an amazing amount of ground, including a sequence showing Kane inventing the popular press, a record of his marriage, from early bliss to the famous montage of increasingly chilly breakfasts, the story of his courtship of Susan Alexander and her disastrous opera career, and his decline into the remote master of Xanadu, I think if you look carefully in the West Wing. Susan, you'll find about a dozen vacationists still in residence. Citizen Kane knows the sled is not the answer. It explains what Rosebud is, but not what Rosebud means. The film's construction shows how our lives, after we are gone, survive only in the memories of others, and those memories butt up against the walls we erect and the roles we play. There is the Kane who made shadow figures with his fingers, and the Kane who hated the traction trust, the Kane who chose his mistress over his marriage and political career, the Kane who entertained millions, the Kane who died alone. There is a master image in Citizen Kane you might easily miss. The tycoon has overextended himself and is losing control of his empire. After he signs the papers of his surrender, he turns and walks into the back of the shot. Deep focus allows Wells to play a trick of perspective. Behind Kane on the wall is a window that seems to be of average size. But as he walks toward it, we see it is further away and much higher than we thought. Eventually he stands beneath its lower sill, shrunken and diminished. Then as he walks toward us, his stature grows again. A man always seems the same size to himself, because he does not stand where we stand to look at him. Just as the newspapermen in Citizen Kane set out in vain to find an angle on which they could evaluate the subject of Charles Foster Kane's death, approaching Orson Welles' motion picture today might be equally futile. The film has been endlessly explored and investigated, researched by countless film historians, analyzed by top scholars, while biographers have found many links between Welles, Kane, and newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst, the figure on whom Kane was based. For the last several decades, these exhaustive assessments have resolved that Welles' picture is cinema's finest treasure. Through the film's story, its production and tumultuous release, and the biographical strains therein, Citizen Kane has been described as a work of art imitating life and life imitating art. What more can be said by academics, cineasts, or critics? The investigation of Welles' picture is no less complicated than the one in the film, wherein the crucial component is Rosebud, the word uttered with Kane's dying breath, and the missing piece of his life's jigsaw puzzle. What is it, and could one word really define a human being so succinctly? It'll probably turn out to be a very simple thing, remarks one of the reporters. Indeed, although the secret of Rosebud is a revelation given to the audience alone, its disclosure is illusory, less a key than a missing piece in a larger complex of puzzle pieces, and should any one of them go missing, the picture would be just as incomplete. Just as it is for the reporters in the picture, it's the investigation of Citizen Kane itself that has meaning and sustains its legend. The story of Citizen Kane's journey to the screen is a fascinating exploration of art, business, and politics, steeped in biographical insight into the parties involved, namely Hearst, but especially into the burgeoning talent of Welles. By the time RKO Radio Pictures released the film in 1941, Citizen Kane had defied the controversy and scandal around its production, barely survived destruction at the hands of competing studios and threats issued by Hearst, and represented an unprecedented achievement in Welles' body of work, one that could never be matched over the next 4 decades of his career. Box office indifference sealed the film's reputation until, after Hearst's death in 1951, a reassessment began that declared Welles' picture one of the greats, a film long associated with unchallenged hyperbole about its importance and status as the best motion picture ever made. And while the film itself is undeniably significant, above all in its technical breakthroughs and narrative innovations that expanded film as an art form, it is the film's story that has cemented its legacy. Welles' film avoided destruction and was later hailed as a masterpiece, perhaps the finest masterpiece in all of cinema. This represents an unprecedented triumph of the artist against the system, and therein lies the profound resonance of Citizen Kane. A wunderkind and innovator of stage and radio, Orson Welles and his Mercury Theatre Company caught the eyes of Hollywood after his infamous radio adaptation of H.G. Wells' classic The War of the Worlds, broadcast in 1938 in a series of false news bulletins about a Martian invasion. The entire broadcast, complete with faux commercials, music, and all, was designed by Welles for maximum believability. When listeners panicked and ran for the hills, some didn't emerge until weeks later, Wells' talent was cemented in the public consciousness. Soon after, RKO President George Schaefer offered Wells an extraordinary contract that entitled the untested filmmaker complete control over direction, script, production, and final cut over 2 motion pictures. Moving to Hollywood, Wells began to develop several ideas that never materialized, including a first-person take on Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, in which the camera would replace the protagonist, and a British thriller called The Smiler with the Knife. But these ideas were far too small and not controversial enough for the boy wonder who had frightened thousands of listeners with his radio broadcast. Wells and Herman J. Mankiewicz, an experienced screenwriter who entertained Wells with his tales of Hollywood's early years, finally chose their subject when Wells discovered exhaustive notes for Mankiewicz's unwritten book on Hearst. Mankiewicz had attended Hearst's elaborate and star-studded parties as a Hollywood writer, and therefore had an inside view of Hearst's life with his mistress, actress Marion Davies. Mankiewicz was friends with fellow screenwriter Charles Lederer, Davies' nephew. For Wells, Hearst was ripe for exposure and, given the eventual script's unabashed allusions to Hearst's personal life, hidden behind the thin disguise of Charles Foster Kane, Wells was sure Hearst would retaliate. What he didn't expect, however, was that the film would almost be destroyed in the process. William Randolph Hearst was one of the most powerful, connected men in the United States, if not the world. A millionaire magnate whose yellow journalism tactics filled his publications with notes of scandal and the personal lives of politicians and movie stars. At his height, Hearst controlled almost 30 newspapers and magazines across the country, reaching upwards of 20 million readers. As such, he held significant influence over the media and public opinion. A larger-than-life figure, Hearst lived at Hearst Castle in San Simeon, California, on a property reportedly half the size of Rhode Island, in a palace filled with an abundance of sculpture and artwork from around the world. At one point, he was responsible for 25% of the world's art market, much of it sold at auction as the Depression wore on his empire. Despite his status, he was not immune to scandal. Hearst's newspaper editorials had, as believed in many circles, sparked an assassination attempt on President William McKinley. His Catholic wife refused him a divorce when he pledged his devotion to his long-standing mistress, Davies. He manipulated public opinion in favor of the Spanish-American War. When silent filmmaker Thomas Ince was shot aboard Hearst's yacht and died in 1924, the scandal was covered up, though it was believed a dispute between Hearst and Charlie Chaplin over Davies caused the notorious gunshot, and he was an ardent isolationist who thought the U.S. should not be involved in the looming World War II. For Wells, Hearst represented the antithesis of everything in which he believed. But he was determined to portray a sympathetic monster, while Mankiewicz viewed Hearst as a megalomaniacal figurehead to be decapitated. After being expelled from Hearst's circle for his excessive drinking, Mankiewicz harbored a deep hatred for Hearst, as evident in his initial script drafts, an unsentimental portrait then called American. Wells was forced to temper and organize the script, and the extent of his contribution to Mankiewicz's original draft has long been a source of contention among film scholars and even those involved. However, Wells was famous for rewriting established material to suit his own needs, such as his stage revisions on Thomas Decker's The Shoemaker's Holiday or his famously all-African-American production of Shakespeare's Macbeth set in Haiti, nicknamed Voodoo Macbeth. But as early script drafts housed in the Lilly Library at Indiana University that predate American suggest, through Wells' handwritten notes to Mankiewicz, the final screenplay was a joint effort by both writers. Without the ego or the typical history rewriting elaborations for which Wells would be attributed later in his career, Wells told The Times in London in 1969, "The initial ideas for this film and its basic structure were the result of direct collaboration between us." Indeed, to humanize Kane, Wells fashioned parallels to his own life that had no equivalent in Hearst's. When, as a boy, Kane's mother sends him away to be raised by a bank, Hearst was raised by his mother. Kane is the same age as Wells when his idyllic childhood ended with his mother's early death, leaving Wells to be raised by two ineffectual fathers, one adoptive, one biological, and a demanding school for boys. Many aspects of Citizen Kane, such as Kane's failure in politics and reckless spending, remain harsh indictments of Hearst and his lifestyle, so much so that Wells would later admit he felt the picture's reflection and treatment of Davies was unfair. Something of a dirty trick, he called it. Dorothy Cummingore plays Susan Alexander Kane, a bubbly singer whom Kane tries and fails to transform into an opera star. When her career bombs, she's reduced to drinking and completing elaborate puzzles alone in Kane's opulent estate, Xanadu, named after Kublai Khan's summer capital visited by Marco Polo. Davies, a talented actress and comedienne who Hearst tried and failed to present as a dramatic performer, was likewise known for her puzzles and boozy ways. Furthermore, Rosebud was Hearst's pet name for Davies' private parts, and the significance of Rosebud on and off-screen dealt a particularly low blow to Hearst. But then there's Xanadu, a vulgar description astoundingly not unlike the Hearst castle. Xanadu first appears in the opening shots of Citizen Kane like a vampire's castle, surrounded by fog, moats, and rowboats that resemble ferries meant for the river Styx. Contained inside is the loot of the world: countless statues, paintings, gargoyles, and stonework imported from exotic countries. Some of the pieces Kane has never seen, he just wants them for the sake of having them. Susan, too, is just an object in his collection. Everything is housed inside rooms so large that their vastness dwarfs their occupants. Exchanges between Kane and Susan in these rooms would have an almost comical effect if the scenes themselves were not rooted in such powerful drama, the two standing on opposite sides of a room, their voices echoing, their figures lost in the enormous spaces around them. Citizen Kane's most redemptive quality as it relates to its depiction of Hearst is that, aside from the occasional gross detail mirroring Hearst's private life, Kane is a tragic, curiously sympathetic character. Kane is introduced in the film's opening newsreel sequence, through which the course of his life is outlined for the audience. What's lacking is an angle, says the newsreel editor, who assigns a reporter named Thompson, played by William Alland, whose face remains unseen, to investigate Kane and search for the meaning of Kane's dying last word. What follows is a series of flashbacks told to Thompson by those close to Kane, moments in which Kane shows his callousness or kindness, depending on the account. In the memoirs of the late Walter Parks Thatcher, George Coulery's, a banker and Kane's guardian during his childhood, Thompson finds the story of a reckless, idealistic young adult with no interest in money, who is given vast wealth but instead chooses to develop a struggling newspaper. Joseph Cotten plays Jed Leland, Kane's close friend who began by admiring Kane's philosophy of honest journalism until he later witnesses Kane sell off his journalistic scruples. Through Leland's eyes, Kane became an irredeemable monster bent on acquiring power and servicing his own ego, whereas Susan would remember the late Kane as a heartbreaking story, a man lost by want and desire that could never be fulfilled. In each case, the audience must consider the narrator's subjectivity and question whether they are reliable. Certainly, there are subtle contradictions or gray areas about Charles Foster Kane in these accounts. They do not perfectly align like pieces of a puzzle into a full portrait of Kane, which is then finally made whole by our understanding that Rosebud was Kane's childhood sled in filming the picture. Wells, an untested filmmaker with a genius status to live up to and therefore something to prove, tirelessly prepared his production and learned all he could about making motion pictures before Citizen Kane was officially greenlit. Though he was inexperienced, he instinctively grasped the juxtaposition of sound and image. He understood that several shots make a scene, multiple scenes make a sequence, and those sequences make a whole film. Achieving a flow between scenes and sequences, the technical aspects of the film and the narrative would result in a desired overall balance. Moreover, he concerned himself with layering technical elements: composition, acting, editing, makeup, dialogue, lighting, music, and narrative structure with almost literary meaning, and as such, each element was rethought to put distance between Citizen Kane and other Hollywood productions. For a month before RKO greenlit the film, Wells shot test scenes to experiment with his new craft, When the heads of RKO saw this surprisingly polished test footage, they not only approved production but also used it in the finished film. On the set, Wells demanded a deviation from Hollywood normalcy, and he jealously cast actors he could trust from his Mercury Theatre Company, including Cotten, Gore, Coolidge, Everett Sloane as Kane's financial manager, Mr. Bernstein, Ray Collins as the corrupt politician Geddes, Paul Stewart as Kane's snide butler, and Agnes Moorehead as Kane's mother. Also from the Mercury Theatre, he hired Bernard Herrmann, later the composer of many Alfred Hitchcock thrillers, to write the music. In a 1970 interview with Dick Cavett, Wells remarked, "I didn't have anybody saying you can't do that. I just had a sort of pause and then, well, that's never been done, but we're gonna try it. So I had a marvelous spirit." For example, he insisted that the sound editor not use RKO's library of sound effects but instead create new audio effects for the film. He also insisted on expensive special effects sequences, usually filmed only once for cost purposes, being reshot several times to ensure the best results. When it came to Wells finding a cinematographer, his choice was easy. Greg Toland, John Ford's cinematographer on The Grapes of Wrath and The Long Voyage Home, both from 1940, made his way into Wells' office and demanded that the young director hire him. "I want you to use me on your picture," he said. "I want to work with someone who never made a movie." To prepare, Wells and Toland studied Ford's films, particularly Stagecoach, 1939, closely, as Wells had long admired Ford's work. Later on in his career, when he was asked to name his favorite directors, Wells famously replied, "I prefer the old masters, by which I mean John Ford, and John Ford." The walls of Wells' office were covered with drawings and ideas about the visual presentation, but as Wells learned the craft of filmmaking, he quickly formed a desire to experiment within the medium. Together, Wells and Toland reinvented the cinematic wheel, employing no end of new camera tricks and unconventional devices. For the newsreel scenes, Toland shot on grainy stock and toyed with film speeds. To put objects in both the extreme foreground and distant background into focus, he used the split diopter lens. He shot with an early shaky cam format to imitate spy footage. When Wells wanted a lower angle than the stage floor could provide, they dug a hole in the concrete floor to get lower, and they avoided standard studio practices of close-ups and overhead lighting. They found ways to make what they wanted work on film, often experimenting not only for its own sake but also to create an innovative style that reflected a scene's purpose in ways never achieved before. Toland saturated the film with his signature deep focus photography, in which everything within the frame was clear, and he shot scenes with ceilings to create a sense of realism and unique lighting effects. French critic André Bazin once argued that deep focus enhances a film's uncertainty because the camera's focus doesn't tell the viewer where to look, and so Wells and Toland leave the viewer to judge Kane at their own discretion. "Everything we need to know is up there on the screen, but we must decide where to look." Encouraged by how Wells welcomed a collaborative atmosphere on set, Toland reciprocated and taught Wells everything he needed to know as a young filmmaker on the technical side. For his collaborative spirit and contributions, Wells gave Toland credit on the same title card as himself, a rare honor seldom bestowed in Hollywood. Wells and RKO agreed to keep the production under wraps in fear of inciting Hearst's wrath. However, both the studio and their young director knew a battle over Citizen Kane would occur sooner or later. Rumor had begun to build that a film about Hearst was in production at RKO, and, albeit indirectly, Hearst took action to suppress it. Devout Hearst loyalist and gossip columnist Hedda Hopper wrote in her column that RKO's production of a film based on Hearst's life has become an industry affair and will be dealt with accordingly. Hearst applied pressure to MGM head Louis B. Mayer with a threat to publicly expose Hollywood's top moguls as Jews in a seemingly unrelated smear campaign. Mayer, in turn, made an offer to RKO's George Schaefer to buy all prints of the film for a reported $805,527 and change, just enough to cover the film's costs. Schaefer refused the bribe. Wells, meanwhile, made his feelings on the subject well known in a statement to the press in which he alluded to the possibility of buying the prince himself and taking legal action against RKO. "Under my contract with RKO, I have the right to demand that the picture be released and to bring legal action to force its release." Pressure from Welles and Schaefer convinced the RKO board to side against selling the film. Furthermore, Welles and Schaefer tipped the scales in their favor throughout Hollywood by arranging private screenings of Citizen Kane for many important filmmakers, including Frank Capra, John Ford, Alfred Hitchcock, and Ernst Lubitsch. Trusted men from the press were also invited to these screenings and used their influence to defend the picture. Time magazine wrote, "Hollywood is about to destroy its greatest creation," and Newsweek writer John O'Hara proclaimed, "It is with exceeding regret that your faithful bystander reports that he has just seen the best picture he ever saw. Reason for regret: you, my dear, may never see the picture." With this, the Hearst sympathizing Newsweek fired O'Hara. Hearst attacked in other ways, such as refusing to carry advertisements or reviews for Citizen Kane, or any promotions whatsoever. Welles and Schaefer remained steadfast, and RKO finally released the picture in May 1941, with the premiere held at New York's RKO Palace on Broadway, followed by a slow expansion in the coming weeks and months. Box office performance was hardly the splash everyone seemed to think it would be. Despite the controversy, the public was uninterested and showed lukewarm attendance, regardless of the monumentally high critical praise and media coverage of its bumpy road to the screen. Welles' efforts went all but unnoticed at the time, exploding with a whimper. At the following year's Academy Awards ceremony, Citizen Kane was nominated in 9 categories, including Best Art Direction, Best Cinematography, Best Sound, Best Music, Best Editing, Best Actor, Best Director, and Best Picture. Only Mankiewicz and Welles would receive an award for Best Original Screenplay, while the majority of Citizen Kane's nominations were lost to John Ford's How Green Was My Valley. Nevertheless, the industry as a whole was divided in its assessment of both Welles and his contentious, dangerous film. Opinions about the young upstart Welles were evident whenever his name was mentioned during the Oscar ceremony, and he was greeted with boos. Still, among critics, the film was expected to sweep the Oscars. When it didn't, Variety ran a headline afterward stating Orson Welles' near washout rated biggest upset in Academy stakes. Rather than view him as a victim of Hearst's bullying reign over the media, Hollywood saw Orson Welles as a dangerous, risky, and unbankable talent to have on the payroll. After Citizen Kane's release, Welles spent a little over a year at RKO before the studio ejected him from their offices, and his reputation was solidified as an unemployable director. During this time, RKO renegotiated its contract with Welles and removed his final cut clause. Welles' second production under his now revised RKO contract was an adaptation of Booth Tarkington's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel The Magnificent Ambersons, 1942, the film that the studio infamously took away from Welles in post-production, recut, and burned the edited-out footage. The subsequent film remains ingenious but not Welles' original vision, and since the excised footage was destroyed, it may never be seen as Welles intended. Welles' reputation after Citizen Kane, his unfortunate habit of losing his vision to meddling studio bosses, and his struggle to secure financing for his independent projects would haunt him for the rest of his career. In effect, he needed to start over. Citizen Kane wouldn't be praised as the greatest film ever made for another 15 or more years. And so, his mid to late career left him with the persona of an overconfident, independent genius without resources, desperately trying in his unique, bombastic way to secure funds for his latest project. Films like The Stranger, 1946, The Lady from Shanghai, 1947, Mr. Arcadon, 1955, and Touch of Evil, 1958, were each taken away and re-edited by intrusive producers. In some cases, the edited footage was not destroyed, and film historians, working from Welles' detailed notes after his death in 1985 at the age of 70, could reassemble and restore Welles' vision. In most cases, the original intent of these films has been altogether lost. Citizen Kane would be the only time in Welles' career as a filmmaker when he set out to make his picture with complete artistic freedom. Every film historian and Orson Welles biographer has at one point asked the question, what happened to Orson Welles after Citizen Kane? Was his downfall self-propelled, or was he a victim of an industry populated by enemies who felt threatened by his talent and his objective to elevate films to the rich and complex level of high art? No doubt, Welles made enemies in Hollywood who would never let up after the Citizen Kane affair. Much like Charles Foster Kane, the story of Orson Welles' career is a tragic one. In his appraisal of Citizen Kane, David Bordwell assessed the film in such a way that it oddly describes Welles' life as well, a tragedy on Marlowean lines, the story of the rise and fall of an overreacher. Like Tamburlaine and Faustus, Kane dares to test the limits of mortal power. Like them, he fabricates endless personae which he takes as identical with his true self, and like them, he is a victim of the egotism of his own imagination. Of course, this association links Welles to both Kane and Hearst, the three figures bloated by their character and self-indulgence. Hearst and Kane each accumulate an absurd amount of property and works of art, the excesses growing around them and overshadowing the individual. Welles, without the money to obtain vast collections or acquisitions, lived large nonetheless and transformed himself into a phenomenon as a human being, a Dorian Gray in reverse, as Clinton Halen observed. Welles traveled the world and enjoyed food and cigars. Invariably, he was always the smartest person in the room. For his love of food, he grew outward, hidden behind his shockingly expanded frame, turning himself into a corpulent yet undeniable figurehead of his myth. Without the ability to buy Xanadu for himself, he became the physical expression of his celebrity and used his public image to exploit the very thing he fed, his legend. Both ironic and tragic, Welles, in a way, became the very thing he despised. Biographers have tried tirelessly to understand what happened to Welles after Citizen Kane, just as film historians and critics have attempted to summarize the film itself. Some believe the film to be nothing more than a cautionary tale about the dangers of wealth and power, others think Welles made a deeply compassionate tragedy and character study. Although we can only speculate about Welles, his only fully realized motion picture offers a singular key to unlocking the mysteries of Charles Foster Kane. But Rosebud is less the final piece of the jigsaw puzzle that is Kane's identity than a symbol of his indefinable humanity, a symbol which signifies how Kane is a man of, as Welles himself put it, many sides and many aspects. It was my idea to show that 6 or more people could have as many widely divergent opinions concerning the nature of a single personality. Citizen Kane is a complex story about the failures of a very big and powerful man, reflecting an equally powerful man, and told through the eyes of an artist of incredible talent. Contrary to what Rosebud intimates, it offers no direct answers and instead demands investigation and reflection. In the last scenes, one of the men wandering through Kane's treasures in Xanadu remarks, "I don't think any word can explain a man's life." Aside from the film's not insignificant storytelling and formal acumen, what it represents is far more important, both for the film and for understanding Orson Welles. Bookend on Citizen Kane are shots of Xanadu's gates on which a sign reads "No trespassing," and as the director of a film or author of a film analysis discovers, encapsulating an individual or artwork is not about jumping the gate to find a solitary answer, but gathering accounts, facts, and testimony, and through them, assigning meaning. Perhaps the film's most resonant quality is that, through its story and production, Welles inspires the same investigative process in viewers about himself and his picture, forcing an awareness of how the film's journey to find an angle yields a greater, far more intricate understanding. This film, directed by Orson Welles, screenplay by Herman J. Mankiewicz, produced by Orson Welles, starring Orson Welles, cinematography Greg Toland, edited by Robert Wise, music by Bernard Herrmann, production companies RKO Radio Pictures, distributed by RKO Radio Pictures, release dates May 1, 1941, running time 119 minutes, country United States, Language English. Budget $839,727. Box office $1.8 million.